A lot that I'm looking forward to as a preacher. We're going to have a sermon next week on thankfulness and why is it so hard for us to be thankful in a deep soul place. And then we're going to go into Advent, which is honestly just one of my favorite times of year. Our family already has our Christmas tree up. We did our Christmas lights yesterday. I'm ready and excited for Advent, and because ultimately it's about Jesus. And so, but for us, we're kind of closing out this Free to Follow series, and if we could focus on that and look at what God's Word says for what does it look like for us to find freedom in our finances. That's something that doesn't necessarily come together very naturally, does it? Because when we talk about finances, it's usually we never have enough. It's usually debt. It's usually kind of a defeatist mindset. But what does it look like for us to actually find freedom? And once again, this isn't about amounts. It's about faithfulness. And we're excited for what God has for us as we stop judging ourselves and other people, but pursue God's perspective. Because God desires us to have freedom in our finances to follow Christ. There's a purpose in our freedom, and that's to find contentment. That's to experience peace in this life and have that freedom. And so a little bit of a review what we talked about. The first week we talked about our desires in our own heart, the fact that there's an interesting correlation in between our financial desires and our spiritual desires. They cross over pretty significantly if we are able to be honest with ourselves. If we are focused on ourselves and pursuing things ourselves, that's going to affect how we pursue things with Christ. And if we find freedom in our finances, it allows us to find freedom in our spiritual lives. And so for us, we need to see God as the source. The second week, we talked about habits that we can create and that don't lead to bondage, which is what debt does. Debt will eventually lead us to bondage. I'm not sure if you guys have had that moment when you have taken out a debt beyond your ability to pay and you don't know what you're going to do. Or when you have a car that's upside down or whatever the situation may be, and you just feel those chains that we talked about. That's a hard moment, and no judgment. That's just a reality many of us have been in. But for us, there's this idea of balanced savings, of balanced pursuing of... I just lost that, didn't I? Oh, my back. There we go. A balanced way of pursuing those habits and stewardship of our resources. And then the last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked about generosity. And that generosity is an antidote for greed and the never enough mentality. If we just live in the waters that we live in, if we're fish with the air that we breathe, is greed. It's about me. It's about what I can get, me. And yet an antidote for that is generosity. This week, we're going to be looking towards the future. What are some practical habits I can do today that will set me up to be free to follow Christ in the future? Doesn't that sound awesome? And yet, it's something that sometimes can fall and be pretty hard for us to do. And so the first thing I want to talk about, it's kind of a perspective reality. The first thing that we must do to have financial freedom for the future is to simply stop setting others up on a pedestal. Stop looking at other people as the example. This can happen when we look at, especially when we look at successful people and we see their success and we see their resources and all we see is God's blessing. And we see that if they have more than us, then they are more blessed than us. And we want to pursue that idea. But we can also look at the other side of things. And we can put people that are struggling in poverty up on a pedestal too. There's a time where we can look at people that are struggling and needing to find God in every little thing, and we see that as living out God's life. Is because when we have a lack of resources, it is a simple reality. There's a greater dependence upon God. And that's a beautiful thing. And we can look at both of these different pedestals, and there could be dysfunction in trying to pursue either one for ourselves. Because the answer is, instead of looking at other people's pedestals, we need to be obedient to what God has done in our heart. What God is calling us to, the situation that God is calling us into. Ecclesiastes 5:19 says this: Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions, the ability to enjoy them and to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift from God. There's nothing wrong with having resources. There's nothing wrong with having wealth. It's not good or bad. It's what you do with it. It's how you live in that life. But if all we're doing is trying to pursue one way or the other, we're going to miss God in the obedience. Because it's funny because we can see those positive sides when we put them on the pedestals, but also when people are on the pedestals, it's a whole lot easier to throw rocks at them. It's a whole lot easier for us to be judgmental because we look at people that don't have a lot of resources and they make decisions, and sometimes we can stand judgment over them and say an emergency comes and we can be like, I feel like you could have saw that coming. You could have made a better, more responsible decision, and we can judge them. Or we can see somebody that has a lot of resources and judge them for that and say, man, if I had that, I would do X, Y, or Z. They must be corrupt. They must take advantage. Because they have wealth. And either way, it's an assumption. Because wealth, as we talked about here in Ecclesiastes, encourages us. Wealth and possessions are neutral. It's how we're obedient in loving people. John Wesley made this wonderful statement. Make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. The point is all you can. The resources are the Lord's. The point is to stay obedient to God's voice and direction, avoiding greed and overdependence upon ourselves, and never falling in, or trying not to fall into that never enough mentality. So that's the first thing for us. The second thing is to find financial margin. For us to think towards the future, we have to have some level of margin. And margin is that next step beyond simply spending less than you make. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, that's basically the most basic part of finances, but it's also one of the hardest. Because the world just constantly pushes us to 110%. To go beyond your needs. You deserve that thing. You need that thing. Go get that thing. It's all about the things and the experiences and the conveniences. And you deserve it all. You should get it all. But the truth is, we are called to have margin. We're called to plan. Margin is that space in between what you are spending and what you make, and you have a little bit of a margin in that. And that margin creates that ability to plan to the future. Proverbs 21 says this, the plans of the diligent leads to profit, as surely as haste leads to poverty. It allows create that space. Hebrews 5 talks about maturity, and what does it mean for us not to be babies in the faith? And some of us kind of inherit habits or start habits in our lives, and then we never grow up from them. We never take another step. We just keep going. If we're winning or losing or somewhere in between, we just keep going, and we can't break out of that reality because for us, it's just hard to do something different. And that's true in every area of your life. But until you find margin, there is going to be some significant frustration in your life. Margin allows you to go through unexpected things, struggles that can turn into hope. But it rarely happens unintentionally. Anyone accidentally fall into margin? If we're talking about work, if we're talking about our spiritual lives, if we're talking about finances, margin never comes naturally to us. But it creates space. Creates space for us to follow Christ and be obedient. Romans 12:2 says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed in the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will, his good, pleasing, perfect will. This applies to so many areas, but it also applies to how we live our lives with finances, because the pattern of this world, as I said a minute ago, is to the maximum all the time. It's to live in discontentment instead of contentment. And that will affect your spiritual lives. And so for us, we're called to plan for the future. As that proverb says, the plans of the diligent lead to profit. There's a really cool example of a missionary in 1813, Adoram Judson. I'm going to butcher that name, but it's up there. Him and his wife they were the first missionaries to Burma. And it was a place that was incredibly hostile to missionaries. Judson and his wife spent 6 years before they saw the first person come to know faith. Can we sit in that for a second? So they had a different idea of judging success. His wife wrote to her father saying, "Papa, nearly 6 years in Burma and we finally have a convert. And that makes it all worthwhile." One person coming to faith and she's ecstatic. What a great testimony of diligence and patience in a spiritual battle. But hear me, they stayed in that mission field for 38 total years. The Judsons diligently sowed seeds of the gospel, and they never saw any major results. 38 years of not knowing the results of your efforts. And yet, today, some almost 200 years later, 3,700 congregations, 1.9 million Christians can trace their origins back to their ministry. We never know what legacy we can have in our lives. We never know what the toil of life can be. And we also don't know how to judge our success or our failures. It's much more important for us to judge our faithfulness and obedience. And that is true spiritually, but also financially. Because we are called to steward our legacy. And if we're going to be able to look into the future, we're going to have to be able to do that. Now, when we talk about this financial reality, we're going to come back to Judson's story in a second. But as we look into stewarding our legacy into the future, we got to remember there's different ways that finances affect us. The first is personally. How many of you guys, I'm not going to actually, don't raise your hands, I'll just do it for us. How many of you have felt bad about yourself because of your financial situation? That the enemy used it as a way of condemnation, of judgment, to make you feel less than because of your situation. Now, I'm really not asking you to raise your hands, but how many of you have had a conversation or heated conversation with a spouse about money? Once again, don't raise your hand. One of the main areas of disagreement is finances because it speaks to priorities. It speaks to how you judge resources, security, all of these things. It affects your children. We can say time and time again, when it comes to the way we handle our finances, way more is caught than taught. Even as you look back on your own parents and how they handled with money, you could see how it affected you. That legacy matters. The impact matters. The way that you can be generous to a local church or to a missions organizations or for us, our engaged partners around the world, our friends here. When we support people outside of ourselves, it has an incredible impact. One that we may never know the full extent of. But we need to take control of stewarding that legacy. Just like the Judsons, without maybe knowing the results that may come out of it. Let us be a people that are just faithful and obedient in our spiritual lives, in our financial lives, as a whole people. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for those of their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's Paul speaking to Timothy. That's some harsh words, is it not? There's responsibility for caring for those that we have responsibility for. Proverbs 13:20 says, A good person leaves an inheritance to their children's children. So as we steward into the future, we are able to have an honest reality that as followers of Christ, we have a hope that's beyond death. Just like the Judsons didn't know what was going to happen, they sowed their entire life into something that they knew they probably wouldn't see the reality of. That's something that Christians uniquely have the capability to do because death is a reality, but it has been overcome in Christ. And so we are able to suffer, we're able to go through, we're able to invest in things that we may not see in this life, but it can go beyond us. That's what a legacy is able for us to do. And so Benjamin Franklin, I don't know how specific this is, but it's been stated for years, and I've seen it all over the places. He made this statement: in this world, nothing can be certain except death and... It's true. It's coming for us. Billy Graham had this statement: our days are numbered. One of the primary goals in our life should be to prepare for our last day. The legacy we lead is not just our possessions, but the quality of our lives. Planning for our legacy is not just the stuff, though that is important, but also as Christians, the hope that resides in our faith. And that legacy can be shared and seen over and over again. It's the whole reality of us, financially, spiritually, relationally, planning for that legacy into the future. Now, I am a very practical person. I don't usually think in theoretical terms, but what does it actually look like for us to steward our legacy? Simply, on a practical sense, the first thing is for you to deal with whatever financial mess you may have now. If it's a little mess or a toddler version of your house just getting utterly destroyed mess, a financial mess is never easier to solve than right now. There will never be a better time, even as we are going into the holidays, even as we are planning trips, even as all the things are coming, to begin to plan how to solve and to move forward in your finances. Today is the best day to do that. So seize that opportunity. Don't let this moment pass. The second, if you have young children, if you have people that are dependent upon you, this is more practical than anything. Life insurance might be a great thing to consider. Just practically, something to look into. The third is to look into what does it look like for you to have a will or a trust or power of attorney. This is like just practical, but it's also important. It's important for us to know what your desires are as a family or as an individual for your things and your intentions for after you are gone. But hear me, once again, no one likes to talk about death. But if anybody should be able to talk about death for ourselves, is us. Because we know we have something beyond this life. Beyond that, it's just being responsible for those who follow us. And so seize that opportunity. Even, can we admit these details of life are no fun? This is a mirror moment for myself, even as I was trying to be honest and transparent with y'all. My wife and I did the work of a will a couple of years ago. And I talked to her and looked at it and came to find out, even for ourselves, we have an unsigned will. So we've done all the work, done all the due diligence, had all the conversations with the people who matter and all the things, but we didn't go to the bank to get it notarized. And so, learn from my mistakes. And I tried to take the first step for us. And so this is just a recommendation. This is not 100%. This is just some places to start. I printed off and looked up 3 lawyers. One is in Tampa, Tom Shea. He's the Wesleyan Church's estate attorney. He's someone I've interacted. He's a great guy. He's in Tampa. Then there's 2 others in the Hernando area that I've got good recommendations for. And it'll probably cost some money. But if you are in that moment and you need to plan and prepare for that next, just be like me and let's start this process together again. Because planning for that legacy matters. To care for those who are going to follow us. But let us not just let that be a practical moment, but also a spiritual moment. As you look on your handout, there's kind of the breakout of things that we can do with money. We can live, we can give, we can owe, we can grow. These are the things that we have talked about. And my question as the worship team comes forward, when it comes to looking to the future, is there one of these areas that God is convicting you? That maybe you could find a little bit more freedom. And I'm going to go through these. If you would go to the first one, I'm going to go through these because it's super small. So this will help you a little bit. So you can live. How do you spend your money? Simply tracking your spending. Coming up with a spending plan or a budget. And then as you go beyond that, you get to actually not just live on a budget, but decide how you want to live your life in the finish line. How much is enough, and how can you give and bless beyond that? The next one is give. How can you give generously? Just start to give generously. Greed will seep in until you find a way to be obedient in God's calling to be generous and to give. Then you can go to percentage giving, where you're looking at your income and you're being obedient in the tithe. And then you can get to the next level, which is sacrificial giving, where you're choosing to sacrifice for yourself to give to the church, a missionary, a nonprofit, whatever it may be. The next one is you can owe, which is by far the least interesting or fun, but has the most bondage if we don't grow out of it. Maybe it's paying off a credit card debt. Maybe it's beginning to pay extra on your mortgage. I heard there was someone in our congregation as we were having this Free to Follow, they paid off their mortgage in the last month. Yeah, isn't that? I brag or I joke all the time, nothing drives like a paid off car. I can't imagine what a house feels like. The freedom in that. But sometimes it takes a little discipline to hope, to pay a little bit more to make that happen. But to eliminate that debt provides so much freedom. And I celebrate that. And then the last one is to grow. How can you create an emergency fund? How do you create a margin? Sacrificing a little bit now to have a 3 to 4 month saved up for expenses. Because y'all, life happens, right? And maybe you're in that goal of you have some end of life goals that you're in a season where you could give significant amounts to see something unique happen. And God has blessed you to see that happen. So what is there an area, is there an action that you need to take today to allow God to transform and move and be obedient? So as we lead into this last song, I would just encourage you, don't let this just be a practical lesson that you put on a shelf. What's one thing? What's one action? What's one thing as you plan to the future that God could be calling you into? But let us be listeners of the Holy Spirit as we worship.